Good morning, Happy New Year. Welcome to episode number 207 of Learn with Lorna, where we're looking at a favourite volume of mine, the Inverness Treasurer's Accounts. My name is Lorna Steele-McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service, which has 4 archive centres in the Highlands of Scotland, looking after historic and all manner of interesting documents. We have one in Inverness, one in Fort William, one in Portree and one in Wick. This week we're looking at a collection held in Inverness. This series is brought to you by the Highland Archive Centre, by the High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there is no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we are very, very grateful for that. So again, welcome, Happy New Year. I hope you have had a really lovely break. If you've had a break, I know a lot of people don't get that. But I hope you have made what you can of it. So as I say, this episode we are looking at one of my absolute favourite single documents in the collection. Now, I know that I get accused sometimes of having many favourites, but that's not strictly true. I have 2 favourite collections and a couple of favourite documents, and this is one of my absolute favourite documents. But I will be using one of my favourite collections to help as well. I'm going to describe the physical volume I'm talking about in a moment, and it's worth me doing that. But first I wanted to start with some context about the volume's creation and its place within our collections. So the volume we're talking about today is BI/2/1/1. It is part of BI/2, which is a Burgh of Inverness Treasurer's Department records. BI/1 being the Town Clerk's departments, where the Town Council minutes sit. BI/2/1 are the Treasurer's account books. The rest of BI/2, that the whole Treasurer's department, is taken up with miscellaneous accounts, abstracts, mortgages, and also BI/2 is where the Burgh valuation rolls sit. Because these are to do with income, to do with property values and money, they sit within the Treasurer's department as well. But the volume I'm talking about today is one of the Treasurer's account books. It dates from 1732 to 1790, and it's the first volume that we have in that run of full account books. It's a volume that I use very, very frequently with groups, with tours, with events. So if you have been in and I've done a tour with you, it's possible that you will have seen this volume. I love it. But due to its heavy usage, not just by me, but over the last few hundred years, it underwent some conservation work in 2021. And because of that conservation work, I have a detailed physical description of the item. So not its content, but the physical object, which Richard always writes up before, our senior conservator always writes it up before he does any repairs. He'll write a physical description of the document as an object, as an item. And as I say, not detailing the content, but dealing how it's made, how it's constructed, and so on. He'll then update at the end with what work he's done. So because of that, I'm able to describe really quite in depth what this volume looks like, but I will also share some images after this. The volume is substantial. I'll give it to you in both metric and imperial so that you've got it in both. It's 54 centimetres long by 38 centimetres wide by 8 centimetres deep. And if you'd rather have that in inches, it's 21 inches long by 15 inches wide by 3.5 inches deep. And obviously when it's open, it's double that. So it's about 2.5 feet wide, or 76 centimetres wide when it's open. So it's a big volume. It's very, very impressive looking. And whenever I have it out, people go, oh, what's that document going to be? It's fully bound in vellum, so in animal skin, and it has tightly packed pages of beautifully clear, lovely writing in iron gall ink, which is a very common iron and vegetable ink used in previous centuries, very commonly, still found today. It is one of those volumes that people say, oh, I wouldn't be able to read that, it's from the 1700s. But then they can, and they start to look at it, and they start to pick out words and then be able to read it quite easily. Now, when Richard was repairing this volume, as he was writing a report of what was needed to be done, the boards were bowing, there was a split in the vellum spine, and the corners of the boards were all weak. And when it gets like that, particularly when it's something we use often, there's a responsibility to make sure that it's stabilised and that it's safe to be handled and we're not going to do any damage to it. So as he was doing it, he discovered that despite those issues, that the pages were in remarkably good condition, considering that they were nearly 300 years old, utterly legible, clear writing, and B, this is one of my favourite things, he discovered that there were scribe feather offcuts down inside the gutter and the spine of the volume. And that's where writers of the past have sharpened their quills and brushed or blown the shavings away, and they've fallen down inside the middle of the book. I just found that utterly magical when he showed those to me. Such a connection with the person who wrote that volume. Now, having completely repaired and stabilised and re-sewn the volume, Richard made a new custom-fitting box for it, and within that box he incorporated a little pocket for all the original sewing and those little quill shavings to be kept. And he always does that, and Carrie as well, our other conservator. If they're working on a volume like that, anything that they take off, they'll keep with the original. So if you do want to come in and see this volume, you'll still be able to see those quill shavings that were found in the spine. And I just love that. It's what our conservator Carrie calls book archaeology. So that's what the volume looks like. It's big, it's impressive, it's beautiful, it draws people towards it. How did it come to be created, and what role did its writer have within the town council structure is the next thing to look at. Well, the treasurer, unlike the postmaster of the horse or the town drummer, for instance, it's a role that we're still very familiar with within councils and groups and organisations. I think generally within groups and clubs, it tends to be the role that people don't want to do. Here is an extract from the wonderful Margaret McDougall explaining the structure and the roles within the town council and where the treasurer fits into that. If you haven't been watching Learn with Lorna for long, you will not be familiar with Margaret McDougall. She was, until her death in the 1960s, museum curator for Inverness. She was a librarian, looked after the archive collections, a huge font of knowledge, and we have many of her research notes. And this is her notes on the structure and organisation of the town council. The number of town councillors comprising the town council of Inverness since the year 1676 has been 21. The council constituted a provost, 4 bailies, a dean of guilds and a treasurer with 14 councillors. The council was a self-elective body, the burgesses and citizens having no say in their election. Each September, the council met to elect a new council for the ensuing year from Michaelmas to Michaelmas. The opening words of each official minute recording this meeting reads, "Conform to the ancient and laudable customs of this borough for an electing and choosing of the new councillors for regulating and managing the affairs of the borough for the ensuing year." 5 councillors were changed each year, and their successors were chosen by the old council, who selected burgesses and guild brothers, who, in their opinion, were suitable to serve as councillors. The provost, when elected to the provost chair, served for 3 years, and on the following year became a town councillor before seeking re-election in the following year. Bailies served for 2 years, and the treasurer and dean of guild were elected annually. The provost, bailies, dean of guild and treasurer were elected on the day following the election of the town council. They were elected by vote of the new council and the retiring 5 councillors. So that gives you an idea of the makeup of the town council, and forgive me if I'm stumbling a little bit. I have a sore throat and I'm desperately trying not to let it show. Okay, so that's the makeup of the town council. What did they have control over? What was the town council dealing with? And therefore, what can be seen within the town council's accounts as written by the treasurer? Well, this is what Margaret says. Good old Meg. The council made all decisions in respect of the management of the town. They arranged the affairs of the borough, they collected the revenue, paid its debts, controlled the prices of some commodities coming to the town's markets. They cared for the sick, they helped the poor, they punished the wrongdoers. They employed and selected the teachers who taught in the borough schools. They arranged for additional tradesmen when the number of tradesmen of a certain trade was insufficient to meet the needs of the borough. And they also had a say in certain matters connected with the church. In times of scarcity, the town council arranged for supplies of meal and barley. They regulated or tried to regulate the behaviour of the people. The criminal and the wrongdoer got little sympathy, and justice was harsh. And the provost received a small salary for his role, as did the town clerk and the treasurer. So, bringing that back to this particular volume, one of the things we often say to people in the archive when they come in to do research, we often say, follow the money. Who is paying for what? What is deemed as important by a society? Because following a money trail not only gives a brilliant evidence trail, but it also often gives a really brilliant insight into what matters to a given community or country or group at a certain time. And this is one of the reasons that I love to look at the treasurer's accounts, as I've said so many times, and I've said so many times already during this episode, is that the simplest line within this volume often points to a whole story. You find one sentence and it just spirals your mind away to all sorts of other things. So let's look at some of the stories that are within this treasurer's volume, with that extract from Meg in mind of those are all the things that the council is paying for. So the treasurer is writing down the accounts of the town and we can see where that money is going. So first of all, I'm going to do it through various themes. First of all, I'm going to start with crime and punishment. Now, I would say in my experience of watching people engage with this volume, that this is the subject that most captures people's imagination in the treasurer's accounts. I think it's partly because it's a subject that always does capture people's attention, and people are always fascinated by the history of crime and punishment. But also, I think it's because paying a hangman is so far removed for us in Scotland of what we associate with what a local council does. It's so far out of our familiarity to have an executioner, to have anything like that. That I think that's what it blows people's minds to think that we used to do that. Now, unlike some of the other things that I'll come on to talk about later in the episode, which we still do associate with a local government. So let's join Meg as she gives us an update on the town council. See, I feel like I know Meg. Devastated, as I've said before, that I didn't get to meet her. So this is her update on the best paid employee, the highest paid employee within the council's organisation. The best paid official, and in many ways the most necessary town official, was the executioner, who got the princely sum of £5 per year. For each execution, he got £1. For other services, such as floggings, ducking women in the river, putting them in the pillory, jugs, stocks, etc., he got 6 and 8. He got other extras, such as money for ropes for binding criminals, oil for the gallows, the hangman's noose, and so on. He got a free house situated in the chapel yard, which is a cemetery in the middle of Inverness. He had free fire and light, free boots and clothing, and free fish from the fish market. The last executioner was paid a greater yearly sum than the town clerk, and when he retired in 1834, he had saved £1,000 sterling. And there are hundreds and hundreds of entries in the accounts relating to the administration of justice and punishment within the borough. Here are just a few examples. 22nd of April 1737, ropes to bind the woman that was whipped and banished, 8p to the hangman, or 8p for the ropes, and to the hangman 6p. 29th of April 1737, paid the hangman for whipping 2 women and for cords, 15 shillings and 4p. 18th of June 1742, ropes and cords for an execution and the executioner's fees, £1, 5 shillings and 6p. Carriage of the ladder to the gallows and back, carrying the criminal there in a cart, and grave digging, £2, 2 shillings. Now, many of these, like I say, it's so alien to us of what to have this kind of system within the town, that these things just really spark people's imagination when they look at this volume. But what I find is that many of these are listed under the heading casual expenses, which always seems at odds to me. Sometimes when I'm looking at this volume, I come across terms to do with the executioner that I'm not familiar with. Now, the executioner, as I've said before, would often be referred to as the dimster or the doomster or the deemster within these records, the person who is bringing doom on the accused. So that's a term sometimes that people are not familiar with. But I often come across documents, sometimes that I've never heard before. Now, I would suggest quite strongly that none of you ever go away and look up a wooden horse, which is what I did after finding it in the treasurer's accounts. But I also came across this entry. Just while preparing for this episode, I found an entry that said, "A razor for the hangman for cutting a thief's ear, a cord, his wages, and a gamlet." Now, I've never heard the word gamlet before, and I wondered whether it was a alternative spelling of a gimlet, like a wood boring tool, because I thought that's potential. There was nothing to be found in the Dictionary of the Scots Language, which is usually my go-to place for things like this. But my colleague Jamie from Ambala found the answer for me, and it's pretty unpleasant, although in my imagination not as unpleasant as the wooden horse. The description is, it was a specific device used by hangmen, a type of iron collar that was used to hold the condemned person in position prior to execution. It's an unbearable and horrible thing for us to think about, but it's a reality of the time. And for me, it's a new word that I've learned. Now, many of these entries to do with crime and punishment in the treasurer's accounts relate to people in the toll booth, but some relate to convicted criminals held in the vault. Now, I've mentioned the bridge vault before, the black hole. And here it is described by Leonella Longmore in her brilliant book Inverness in the 18th century. As for the jail, Captain Edmund Burt wrote, "The prison is a weak old building, and the town is not in condition to keep it in repair." And the councillors petitioned for funds to build a new one. But they had written a petition asking to be able to build a new jail. And the reason they wrote this gives an idea of how bad it was. Adjoining to the courthouse, it consists of only 2 small cells for criminals and 1 miserable room for civil debtors. It is often so crowded with prisoners from the different counties as to render their situation truly deplorable from different countries. To give some idea of which, it is only necessary to mention that there are at present and generally about 30 persons confined in these holes, none of which is above 13 feet square. So that's the normal jail. But Leonella goes on to say, as miserable as this jail was, it must have been luxury compared with the pit that served as an extra lockup in the old stone bridge, the bridge that was swept away in the Great Flood of 1849. When it was built in 1685, a vault of about 6 feet high and 8 feet long was constructed between the second and third arches. In Recollections of Inverness by an Invernessian, Donald Munro describes this hellhole. It was entered from above, in the roadway of the bridge, by a trapdoor, which, when raised, disclosed a flight of stone steps leading to the interior. There was an iron-grated window to the south side of the arch for the purposes of putting in provisions and giving light to such as had the misfortune to be confined therein. There were also 2 small stone benches on each side for resting upon, and a round hole in the floor where the prisoner could put down a flagon with a rope for water, and would also answer the purpose of putting away any filth that might accumulate. And Leonella goes on to say, and yet the dank pit still housed the wretched. An item in the Burgh Treasurer's accounts of 12th of November 1735 details expenses incurred by the hangman paying for burying a man who had died in the bridge vault. So there's these records that talk about the vault. You can see in the treasurer's accounts not only the jail but the bridge vault. For instance, that entry that I mentioned there's another one a couple of weeks earlier for burying somebody who died in the vault. And entries that say the following year for the vault door and the iron grate of the vault pit to be repaired. So you can find all sorts of information there about that. Now, the final thing I want to say about the hangman before I move on, because I am absolutely aware that some people will not be enjoying this talk of the hangman. When I was telling my colleague about this, she was like, oh, that's a nice way to start the new year for everybody. But I do know that people are interested in it. So before I move on from the hangman, I wanted to share one final extract from Margaret MacDougall. One amusing custom concerns the hangman. At the beginning of the 18th century, a MacDonald clansman was under sentence of death. On the day before his execution, some fellow clansmen, fully armed with broadswords and targes, paraded around the town. The poor and I fear timid hangman took fright and bolted. The execution had to be postponed, and the council were furious as the execution entertainment also had to be postponed, and so a new rule was made. Henceforth, for 1 week before an execution, the hangman was put into prison, and only released after he had done his gruesome job. For this term in prison, he was paid 2 shillings a day. Thus, the council made sure that future executions would take place on time. This rule came into force in May 1741. Now, still on the subject of justice, I found it really odd when looking through the Treasurer's accounts that they reveal that when the circuit court came to town, the town drummer used to go round, so there's payments to the town drummer to go round the town, banging his drum to assemble the citizens and the inhabitants of the town, who then went out to the edge of the town to meet the judges and escort them in to their lodgings for the circuit court. I suppose they were technically VIPs, but it still seemed very odd to me that you would all have to go out and bring the judges in. There's also payments regarding how they were looking after the judges when the circuit court was in town. There are payments for cleaning out the toll booth with spades, for sprinkling fresh sand on the floors, for bringing the big carpet down from the church and laying it out for the judges. And if the entertainment of the judges seems interesting, the entertaining of VIPs in general is seen a lot through these accounts, alongside the celebrating of events such as royal weddings, birthdays, things like that. And some of the biggest amounts go towards entertainment. On the 1st of March 1737, marking the Queen's birthday cost the town £55 15 shillings, around £6,600. This is Queen Caroline, the wife of George II. The accounts record payments for carrying the great table down from the town hall to the exchange to mark the event. We can see visiting important people or notable people being entertained. So Sir John Cope and General Wade entertained by the council. On the 6th of June 1738, they paid borough officers to ring the bells on the birth of the Prince of Wales' son. This baby would go on to be George III, who had been born just 2 days earlier. So he'd been born 2 days earlier, and that news had passed to Inverness. Within 2 days, they're having a celebration in the town. There are numerous notes of expenditure on entries for claret, for glasses, for broken, smashed glasses. For example, on the 30th of May 1741, the Treasurer's accounts record the council paying £19 and 16 shillings for 22 bottles of wine taken to the cross to celebrate Admiral Vernon's success and the proceedings at Cartagena, and £1 16 shillings for servants and attendants to be there. In 1742, more than a fifth of the town's revenue of about £6,000 was spent on entertainment. So it really gives you a sense of, it's quite an, what's the way to word it? It's quite a extreme way of life, really. There's the executions and the hangings and the floggings and the whipping through the street happening. And then there's these big celebrations and parties and bonfires and drinking sessions in the town. Now, I mentioned that General Sir John Cope and General Wade were two of those entertained. And both of those were very high-profile figures in the period of the Jacobite risings. Sir John Cope was the commander of the government forces in Scotland, and General George Wade was the commander-in-chief of the forces. I've mentioned previously that there are very few entries within the Town Council minute books to the 1745 Rising and the Battle of Culloden. In fact, there's a blank page where it looks like they were just, the volume was put away. But the Treasurer's accounts do reveal some information about life in the town during that rising. A section of the accounts includes the heading "Repairs and Conveniences Made for the King's Army upon their entering the town on the 16th of April 1746. We see guard houses and sentry boxes and benches being made or repaired. There are buildings that are occupied by troops which need to have repairs made to them. So, for instance, the church, the toll booth, the town hall. We see the charity school, the library, and Achnacoich's kiln, which the army used as hospitals, being entered into the treasurer's accounts as needing repairs. 89 bundles of heather and straw was got for the barracks and the hospitals, presumably for them to sleep on. And in 1745, the king's birthday was marked with even more ceremony, because being seen to mark royal occasions becomes very important in this time period. Soldiers were paid to come from the fort to fire rounds, and 10 men from the Earl of Loudoun's regiment were employed to guard the table and the bonfire. And in October 1746, when the Battle of Culloden has passed and the risings are almost definitively finished, in October 1746, the King's birthday celebrations cost £99, with 87 bottles of claret being drunk at the cross and dozens of bottles being recorded as stolen or broken. And in the aftermath of the Battle of Culloden and the subsequent blowing up of Inverness Castle, you can see within the Treasurer's accounts, because of course the Treasurer and the Town Council, they're discussing repairs to things that have been done. We can see damage within the town. So of course, follow the money, you can see what they're paying for to get repaired. So for instance, there are payments to Robert Anderson, mason, for repairing the vault and the bridge which had been shattered by the guns of the fort and by the castle being blown up. There are materials being purchased to make a new sundial to replace the old one which had been damaged. The grammar school, which had been burnt when being used as a military hospital, had to be equipped with new desks and seats and tables. And of course, we find that information within the Treasurer's accounts, because that's who's authorising those payments for those repairs. And the school that I mentioned there, the grammar school, isn't just mentioned at times of conflict. Throughout this volume, we see payments to the schoolmasters and teachers of the grammar school, the music school, the dancing school, the spinning school, which is upstairs in the town hall. So, for instance, in April 1753, payment to Mr. Barber, teacher of mathematics. December 1753, payment to Mr. Alexander Ferguson, teacher at the grammar school. So we find people's names within this volume. This is not the dull list of expenses that you might expect, as I hope I've illustrated so far, but you find lists of people's names. So those teachers' names are in there, but also you can find people's names in other ways. There are references to apprentices and masters within the Treasurer's accounts. In 1754, the apprentice dues are lifted, and they're listed and split into each of the trades and the incorporated trades and the guild. And they list the dues owed by who to who. So for instance, just taking one trade as an example, in the Wrights, we can find John MacDonald owes £4 to Duncan Grant, square right. Patrick Grant, the apprentice, owes £4 to John Munro, cooper. John Munro to James Gibson, cooper. Colin Spence to John Bailey, right. And the hammermen, the Wrights, the skinners, the shoemakers, the weavers, and the guild brethren, apprentices, are all listed within the Treasurer's accounts for that year. I even found, and you'll know I love a good name, I found the brilliantly named Hossack Macraw being listed. And names can be found in other ways. One of the really fascinating things, which had me in deep conversation with my line manager about this, there's a list in the Treasurer's accounts of the people who have rented the mort cloth. Now, you may or may not remember what the mort cloth was, so let's have a look at Scran, the Scottish, the archive network, for a bit of context about the mort cloth. A mort cloth, from the Latin word mortis, meaning death, was a form of pall, a large cloth, usually black, thrown over a coffin or corpse at a funeral. Mort cloths were usually kept by kirk sessions, the church court in each parish. Some were more elaborate than others, and a wealthier parish might have more than one, including a small one for the corpses of children. They were hired, usually by the family or the next of kin of the deceased, to cover the coffin, if a coffin could be afforded, or to cover the corpse itself, if a coffin could not be afforded. So this is a communal item within the church that members of the community could rent out the mortcloths to give that bit of dignity to the person that they're burying without the expense of needing to purchase something that they were not going to need again. I think it's such a good idea, I really do. So that entry said that it's quite often Kirk Sessions that administer this. But this list is found within the Treasurer's accounts, the Burgh accounts. It's a town mortcloth. What I must do is go back and look at the High Church records to see if they are also administering a mortcloth or if this is the same one. I haven't done that. But I found it very interesting because we can find within this title, within the Burgh Treasurer's accounts, lists of names of people who have hired this mortcloth. And some of them are people who have big houses and big estates who've hired it. And some of them, it is maybe the widow of a tradesman who's died. And they write in it whether they get free access to it or whether they have paid, because some would give that access free to the mortcloth as if people couldn't afford to use it. But I wanted to finish with something a bit different. I want to finish something that we do still associate the town councils with. As I said, most of the things I've discussed there, we don't really associate councils with anymore in this country. But we do still associate the council with infrastructure, with public works. And this is certainly prevalent within the Treasurer's accounts. There are payments to labourers for replacing slates on buildings, to people for, I found one for 8 men cleaning the old pier and removing the large stones out of it. We can find entries that record payments for repairing the walls of the Chapel Yard Cemetery, for repairing breaches in the prison walls. There's evidence of payments for street levelling, for fixing the townhouse roof, for improving and maintaining the road standards, for purchasing land to erect buildings on, and for the construction of a new flesh market, a new meat market, and other buildings that were needed for the town to function. All of town life can be seen in this volume, and that's why I love it. There are so many stories to be teased out. And I haven't even gone into the routes, the sales, the rents, the rent listing of rents and lands occupied by people, the duties due to the council from different things. All of that is in there as well. But I didn't think that would be as exciting to talk about. So there are all sorts of payments. There are some lovely casual incidental ones, things like having the borough's old records bound and protected. I love that. Buying a special chest for storing the town's minutes in because they are seen to be of such value. The proclamations of the Candlemas Fair, so many other things that are recorded within the Burgh Treasurer's accounts. But I wanted to finish by going back to Margaret McDougall and her take on the town council and what they did through this period. She says, often when reading these old papers, I am amazed at the far-sightedness of our old town councils. They made many mistakes, but on the whole they did a good job. They did their best to help the poor, and with the little revenue at their disposal, they did what they could to ease distress and suffering. No widow or fatherless child asked in vain. No sick or suffering person was ignored or left unaided. In days when a workman's wage was £2 a year, the sum of 5 shillings as a charity payment was enough one to keep one in bread and ale, the staple food of the period. Charity, and I use that word because it is how such payments are described within the records, was sometimes a heavy burden. On one occasion, the council was heavily in debt and were forced to economise. In deciding to cease all charity payments for a year or two, they added a footnote saying that their decision covered all applications except those upon whom the Lord has laid his chastising hand. Thus, even in financial difficulties, the council still continued to help those people of weak intellect or mental instability. While this decision may have been partly influenced by the old Highland superstition that it was bad luck to ill-treat a mentally affected person, I am sure that the council was equally influenced by humanity and pity. And I just thought that was an interesting take that Meg wrote in the 1950s, 1960s, with all her experience of delving into these records, knowing them inside out. I often think that she and I would have had a great time chatting to each other, because she loved the same things I do and she delves into the same things that I do. And I just thought that was interesting, that was her take of looking at these records, was that she believed that the town council, through the treasurer, did what they could in the circumstances. So I hope you've enjoyed that. I hope you all now love the treasurer's accounts as much as I do. If you're able to come into the building in Inverness, please come and have a look at this beautiful volume, and I'll share some pictures of it as well for you to have a look at this afternoon. But in the meantime, thank you very, very much for joining me. A very happy new year. Again, I hope it brings you nothing but good things. A reminder that next week we will be looking at pupils and teachers and pupil teachers. And a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there is no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then please do, because we very, very much value it. Thank you.